Good afternoon, everybody. So we're just going to give it a minute or so for some more delegates to jump on. Can see those numbers flying up at the moment, which is great. So good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who I've not met previously, my name's Lona Alcock. I'm the Sector Group Manager here at Pro Manchester, and welcome to what is our second weekly COVID-19 roundup. Delighted that this is supported by Grayling, one of Pro Manchester's members, who have a real insight into what's going on in public affairs, but also wider across branding and across the business community. So delighted that we will be joined by Chris Peacock, who you will have met on last week's webinar, and also with Kat, who's going to give us more of that branding and business perspective. We have obviously started to see a few changes hit this week. I'm sure that it's the case for many businesses, but certainly quite a few of the members that we've been speaking to, that furloughing is taking effect from today, from the 1st of April. We have sadly seen a few businesses start to close, but on a much more positive note, we're really pleased to see how strong Manchester's community spirit is, to see some of those collaborations, those changes, those innovations, and I think Manchester is in a relatively good place to be able to deal with this, and that's one of the things that we're going to touch on today, is just how the business community and the wider community are reacting to all the announcements that came out last week and that are continuing to come through. As with last week, and for anyone who's new joining us this week, we do have a live event Q&A. I've seen we do have a couple have already come through. If you go to the chat function and select live event Q&A, type your question in there. Do let us know who you are and where you're from, so we kind of have a bit of context for that question. They will just come through to me, and I'll publish those questions as we go so that other people can see what's coming through to them as well. And then Chris is going to address some of those questions if we have time and have the knowledge to be able to answer those during the course of the webinar. But Grayling have very kindly also said that if there are questions coming up that are too specific, that don't fit in with their range of expertise, they'll take those offline and direct you to the right support. Also worth mentioning that Pro Manchester does now have a dedicated COVID-19 support page, so we will make reference to a number of packages of support that have come out in the last week or so. There's links through to all of those on those pages, links through to things like cybersecurity that obviously we need to be much more wary of. Now we're all working from home, working remotely, seeing some different challenges there. So please do make use of that resource, and if you have anything that needs to be included on that, let us know. From a more general point of view, we are still very keen to share information between members. So if you do have blogs, ideas for webinars, do just get in touch and let us know. So without further ado, I am going to pass over to Chris, who is going to do the initial introduction. We'll have slightly more of a Manchester focus on the updates that we're seeing, and then he will pass over in turn to Kat. So if you're ready, Chris, I'm sending you live now.
Thanks very much, Ilona, and thank you for the introduction. So yes, following on from what Ilona's just said, the reason why we're doing these webinars has been on the back of the daily briefing that we're doing for Grayling. Obviously, things are moving really quickly, particularly with the government making announcements on a 24-hour cycle now. So we are producing those every day for people, and if you would like one, please, we've got the details of how you can sign up for it or where you can see it on our website. But also we wanted to try and use this as an opportunity to try and condense all those updates into one bite-sized chunk, so it's a concise update for you to see what's going on. I'll start off with talking about Greater Manchester, what's been happening here, then I'll look a bit more nationally, and then we'll take it to a couple of bits of international news as well. And then, as Alona said, I'll pass over to Kat, who's kindly going to speak to us today, particularly around brands and trends that we're seeing because of the COVID-19 crisis that we're in. So to start off with, we'll talk about Greater Manchester and some of the main things that have happened this week. First of all, you may have all seen that the GMEX, as we call it in old money, or the Manchester Convention Centre, is going to become the latest Nightingale hospital. It was announced today that's going to open on the 12th of April. Interestingly, we've been told it's only going to be a step down facility with 500 beds, so it's not going to be for intensive care. It is going to be used to help support the region's hospitals with patients who are suffering from COVID-19. Also, we saw Employed Greater Manchester launched from the Combined Authority and with the Growth Company, a really useful tool for those who are suffering if they have lost their jobs during this time. Particularly though, I think one of the things that really stands out in Greater Manchester, which I don't think other city regions can really demonstrate, is how our Mayor, Andy Burnham, is acting and what he's doing around this crisis. He is showing real leadership. He's certainly tackling the government where he feels that they aren't stepping up to the plate to deal with things. In fact, he said, and I'm quoting from Andy now, so excuse me, overall, I think government is getting most things right, but it's my job to keep pushing them, using my experience to highlight where I think gaps still need to be filled. That's not particularly surprising. Andy has always been a vocal politician and stakeholder in the country. Despite his remit being Greater Manchester, that doesn't make him shy away from larger and bigger issues. He doesn't just focus on Manchester, and that's certainly, I think most people will believe, is to our benefit. He's very proactive and we're all pleased to see it. And some of the key issues that he's challenging government on, as we've seen, is particularly around PPE. He said today that is a particularly big challenge in Greater Manchester. He is working collaboratively with the public sector and private sector to see how that can be addressed here, as well as helping at the national effort. Homelessness, we mentioned last week as well, is a huge issue for Andy. It's something that he cares passionately about, and with the government edict that all homeless people and all rough sleepers need to be housed, Andy has announced that that should be done by the end of this week, and he's been working really closely with the hotels in Greater Manchester to make sure that there are beds for everybody. And finally, the big one, which is really the hot topic, both locally and nationally at the moment, is around testing and the need for more tests. It is a bigger issue than PPE in Greater Manchester, according to the Mayor. And again, it is something that he's really challenging the government on. And it's something we're going to need to see more of. I think that's a more or less a universal understanding now that we need to be looking at testing a lot more. The only other thing that I wanted to bring up from a Greater Manchester perspective, for those of you who are still working in the city centre or do need to travel for work, it has been announced that the trams are going to be reduced to every 20 minutes from this weekend. There has been a significant drop in usage since the crisis started, and we have all been asked to work from home. So something to be aware of if you are still having to travel. Similarly, they've been saying today how Transport for Greater Manchester is having to help subsidise the bus companies. There's again huge fall in usage, and there are concerns from some bus companies that they won't be able to afford to continue running certain services. So Andy and Transport for Greater Manchester are now working with them to make sure at least the core services that help people get to hospitals if they are needed can still maintain running. But that's something I think we need to keep a watching brief on and see what happens next. Nationally, there's been lots happening. They say a week is a long time in politics. That's gone well out of the window now. And very much, there's so much going on nationally that every day there's almost a new announcement. And I'll just touch on a few of those that I think are relevant to all of us. Particularly starting with the high streets and retail. So today saw the first of the 22 billion coronavirus support packages going out to businesses, with grants up to 25k being paid out. Similarly, business rates will not be paid for eligible properties, including those in retail, hospitality and the leisure sector. That's estimated to save firms about 11 billion overall. And also there are wider grants now available for smaller businesses too, which should be going into bank accounts today. That said, the government has had some criticism, despite the positive moves they've made, the back end of that, the actual processing of it and people receiving the money they need hasn't been as smooth. And there are reports around banks refusing emergency loans, demanding specific details that which they've previously been told they don't need to share. And also it's taking potentially weeks for people to receive money. Now, this is a huge threat and the government are recognising this. Only this week in Parliament, a number of MPs have challenged the Treasury, saying that needs to be more guidance on the parameters that banks should be using for loans. So I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see in the next few days greater guidance on that when more and more firms start questioning how can we get this money? We're suffering from this and we need to get a bit more. So also on that, we've seen that the testing the government wants to do is increasing, but there has been some problems with chemicals for the reagent that's needed for testing. They are looking to try and drive that further forward. They are working with industry, and particularly here in Greater Manchester, I know they've said that they are trying their best from a scientific perspective to try and get as much done as possible. There's been a number of initiatives that have been announced in the last week. Free school meals, vouchers will be given to those who are eligible to free school meals if they're no longer in schools. Similarly, Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, announced a 75 million towards repatriating Brits who are still abroad and are unable to get home. One of the big announcements this week that came finally after much wait was the support for self-employed. Taxable grants worth 80% of the average monthly profits over the last 3 years, which have been capped at 2.5k a month. Now, although this has been widely welcomed, there's a considerable number of loopholes in there, and I know from people I've spoken with, there are some who are unable or ineligible for that money, and it's causing some great distress. Again, I think this is something the government will need to look at as more and more cases are brought forward and more hardship is demonstrated to them. I think we've seen through this entire period, the last 2 weeks, that the government have made announcements, then they have been looked at through a microscope to see exactly what the detail is. Where there are gaps and holes, the government then are challenged on it and then have to address it and deal with it. So I don't think by no means is the financial support either for the high street, for the self-employed, for businesses or anyone. I wouldn't say that any of this is the end. I think this is merely the next phase of support that's taking place. So I would say keep an eye on what's happening. If there are areas where you are concerned that it's not being addressed, do look at the support that Ilona mentioned previously from the Pro Manchester website, but also just keep an eye on the news in terms of what's happening. Every day there is new announcements of new activity taking place. And because of the media and people like Andy as our mayor challenging the government on what's going on, it does mean that they keep having to address it and update details. The only other thing that obviously I've not mentioned is that we actually had the coronavirus hitting the heart of government with Boris Johnson getting it. It seems a long time ago now since that announcement came out. He is still works self-isolating in the flat at number 11 Downing Street, and as well as the Health Secretary and Chris Whitty. So it is definitely hitting the heart of government, and there are more rumours of more and more people in number 10 who have been catching it. So I don't think that'll be the end of it. I think there will be more politicians and senior stakeholders who do succumb to it. And their message is always that it just demonstrates that no one is safe from it and how important it needs to be. The final thing for me I was going to bring up is just an international overview of what's happening, particularly thinking of how the economy is going to look in the future, because there are a couple of pieces of quite major news that have come out this week from an international perspective. Firstly, the IMF have said that they've got 85 countries have approached them about short-term emergency assistance in recent weeks. For context, that's double the number of countries who contacted them during the 2008 financial crisis. Further to that, the Chinese central bank main advisor has suggested that China shouldn't set any economic growth targets for this year, entirely down to damage that has been caused to the Chinese economy because of COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, just to finish on a really high note, Goldman Sachs have also revised its predictions for the US economy with an announcement yesterday. They have changed their predictions to say that US unemployment is likely to peak at 15% later this year. Before yesterday, they said it would probably be 9%. And similarly, GDP is forecast to fall 9% in Q1. And then they are then predicting that it will fall a stunning 34% plunge in Q2. And that would be the worst period by far in America's post-World War II history. So it isn't looking particularly great internationally, economically. And so all that is something that obviously is going to affect the wider global economy as we go down the road. So that is the general update in terms of locally, nationally, and a bit wider. Do ask us any questions, or if there is anything that I've not covered that you'd like me to do either today or in other questions or in other times, please get in touch and let us know. But with that, we wanted to make sure these webinars don't just cover the updates of what's going on. We also wanted to try and give you some perspective and some insight of it too. And that's why Kat is joining me today. So Kat is the head of our Manchester office here at Grayling. And she's going to now just talk a little bit about the response to brands and businesses, and also to touch upon what trends we are starting to see emerge from the situation that we're all facing. So Kat, would you like to take over?
Hi. Thanks, Chris. I think I should now be live on our handover. Hi, everybody. So, you know, Chris has already touched on, this is a situation that is so foreign for all of us. It's really to look at trends and behaviours is really evolving on not only a weekly, daily, but even hourly basis. And I'm sure a lot of you are seeing, you know, news items, reports, lots of things flying in. So we are in the process as Grayling of putting together a bit of a trends report of the patterns that we are seeing. But I wanted to just touch on 2 or 3 now. Hopefully to give a bit of positivity, because I know sometimes it can feel there's a lot of negative news coming out, but we are seeing some amazing examples of brand collaborations, of community collaborations, but also kind of real resilience. And I think, you know, true grit and perseverance and kind of spirit is what I think is going to really kind of help bring businesses through this crisis. So I think, again, when we look at the curve of the pandemic, as Chris touched on, the last couple of weeks, we've been in this sort of anxiety phase. We've seen a lot of panic buying. We've seen people unsure about jobs. We've seen a lot of information coming out and people kind of trying to get their heads around what is going on. I think as we move into this week, and obviously there's still a lot of questions about packages of support for businesses, for individuals, you know, words like furlough that we probably hadn't even heard before suddenly becoming into our everyday vernacular. We're moving into this period of adaptation, and I think this is where it's going to get interesting for brands and businesses and their response. But I want us to focus really very focused on retail specifically, because it's an area I'm incredibly passionate about. But I think it's very interesting to look at kind of the scope that we've seen from the big to the independent to the small, and how the responses have differed. And I think it is really genuinely a tale of two cities. So I want to start off just really looking at the food retailers. I'm sure many of you will have obviously visited a supermarket in the past couple of weeks, and the Kantar figures that came out yesterday have shown that actually it was a record month in March. The last 4 weeks we're seeing, I think it was a £2 billion extra pounds put into baskets, which, you know, in terms of when you think about how much prep goes into the supermarkets, you know, pre-Christmas, huge kind of organisation and planning for months. This has been unprecedented in terms of what they've had to face. Now, on one hand, you could think this is brilliant because the supermarkets have seen a massive boon in their profits. But I think what we've seen across the board from the supermarkets has been an absolutely first-class response in comms. They've been collaborative from the offset. You'll probably cast your mind back a couple of weeks to open letter saying they were all working together. We've seen really human-led comms, and human-led comms is a real trend that we have seen coming out of this crisis. So I saw the new Tesco ad last night on TV. It was really focusing on employees within their roles in the supermarket and showing how Tesco and all the other supermarkets are really putting their people first. And when we look at trends and behaviours that are coming out of this crisis, human-led and health and safety, and businesses who are putting their employees first in terms of comms, in terms of how they're delivering both tough and positive news, it is really, really a big trend. So if I look specifically into our region, the Co-op, it is a brand built on its community. It's all of its kind of focus is around its members and its employees. And I think they've come out very well in this, because actually they've consistently been a really great brand and business for a long time. So them giving back to food banks, making sure that kind of funding still going into the schemes they support isn't stopping, giving their staff bonuses, making sure their customers kind of can get access. That feels very natural for the Co-op to do, because they've always done that. And I think where we see brands kind of step out of their lane in this crisis and kind of look opportunistic is when people can have a bit more of a kind of response. Again, you look at someone like Ocado, absolutely digital first business. They actually had a bit of a tough time and were taking some negative backlash because people weren't being able to kind of secure spots. They weren't being able to sign up to the app as new customers. And a trend that we saw in comms even before this pandemic was really about the shift to brands behaving much more transparently and being authentic in their comms. And Ocado, in all of their comms outwards, have said, you know what, we are struggling to hit demand at the moment. This is unprecedented, but we have to put our staff and people first. And again, they've done that in a very human-led approach. I think, and I don't want to name names or point fingers, but I think the brands who are coming out of this crisis badly, and again, we're seeing from kind of research that is now coming about consumer sentiment, is businesses who've not treated their staff well. So, I don't feel I'm pointing fingers by naming someone like Tim Martin from Wetherspoons. I'd say it was his Gerald Ratner moment when he's told his staff to go and find jobs at Tesco. Again, people just thinking that is not the way to behave. At the moment, we need to see acts of kindness. We need to see people supporting their employees. And I think, again, I'm sure a lot of people tuning into this now are having to have tough decisions within their businesses, have difficult conversations, but putting people first and employees and communities and consumers is really, really important. Again, I think, the brands that have not had a great track record for a while, there's questions from employees thinking, why am I still going to this warehouse? Why is my health being put at risk? And that is lots of questions that I'm sure we're all seeing and hearing. Kind of the media are looking for those stories as well. On a more positive note, again, if I focus just on the supermarket sector before moving into looking at the sort of more independence and food and drinks business, Iceland, again, a supermarket that continually punches above its weight in terms of its market share. It did it before the crisis on plastics. Again, first out the blocks when it came to bringing in elderly shopping hours for key workers. But what I like about Iceland as well is they've also put a bit of humanness in terms of the stories they've been telling. So again, we know from speaking to friends, media, people are looking for those moments of light in terms of the shade. It's a really easy story. There was a guy who was meant to go and propose to his girlfriend over in Iceland, the country, and that couldn't happen because obviously we're all stuck at home. And this was before really kind of the self-isolation measures came in. And Iceland just said, they went and proposed in an Iceland supermarket, and they're now going to pay for his honeymoon in Iceland, the country. I said Iceland a huge amount in that sentence, but you get this again. It's those sort of human interest stories that we're all kind of craving for. And I think, again, when we look at the sort of flip side of the high street and retail, the mid-size and indies are really struggling. This is a really hard hit, and we've seen brands disappear or in trouble in the last couple of weeks. Laura Ashley, Carluccio's, Bright House, Carphone Warehouse. Again, a number of those, not saying it was specifically as an output of COVID-19, but I think, again, that sort of like those mid-level, or it's going to hollow out the middle, I would say, this crisis. So in terms of the independents, again, we've seen a huge amount of collaboration. And I think, again, as a trend that we are seeing, community and collaboration is something that really comes to the fore. So again, if that's, looking at where you can take your brand and your business online, that has been huge. So the conversion of offline and online has, again, been something that has happened with such speed. And I think if we're to take anything out of this crisis as well, is that you know, baby boomers, millennials, however you want to call people, have adopted Gen Z behaviours in like time that we'd all have thought before, oh goodness, we couldn't host an event like this. We couldn't ask people to go on a first date online. We couldn't ask people to do a wine tasting virtually. Just seemed crazy. But these behaviours have now really converged, and actually for communities and businesses, particularly on the high street, how it's proving really beneficial. I think in Greater Manchester, you know, the United We Stream initiative, fronted obviously by Andy, but also Sasha Lord has obviously been really prominent in that, helping not only restaurants, bars, but entertainers and people have a platform. Again, the voucher schemes has been really, really successful in actually backing your favourite, you know, whether that's a butcher, a nail salon, a hairdresser. So again, people sort of this spirit of wanting to get behind and support and create communities and collaborate. So, you know, if I was to look and kind of make any predictions about where I think when we come out of this curve in terms of, you know, we're in this adaptation phase, we don't know how long we're going to be in that, but we will come out of this. You know, I was speaking to a contact over in China earlier. I spent a lot of time last year in Hong Kong and China, and they're obviously a couple of months ahead of this. They're all getting back to kind of normal life at the moment, and people are starting to spend again. And there is kind of, you know, that feeling of hope and regeneration. But it takes, you know, scientifically, I think people talk a lot about it takes 66 days to create a habit. So, you know, I think some of the things around kind of off and online experiences merging and creating kind of campaigns and businesses thinking about how they can be a bit flexible and malleable, I think will be stuff that we still see coming out of this. And hopefully some of the positivity. I think the acts of collaboration and community, whether that's business communities coming together, whether that's people setting a WhatsApp group on their street to check on their neighbours. But I think also the sort of idea that we can adopt virtual technology very, very quickly and rapidly and feel really connected are hopefully some of the positive things that we can take out of the crisis. I know it's going to be a tough weeks ahead, potentially months ahead for businesses, but I think the resilience and perseverance a lot of our business owners have will hopefully hold us in good stead to kind of, you know, adapt, challenge and, you know, come out of this with some positivity. I could talk for a long time, as my colleagues will know, and that's I've only covered a couple of trends in terms of human first comms, challenging the status quo and community and collaboration, but there is lots more we're seeing, and I will share the report that we'll be putting out as a business later this week. So I'm going to hand back to Chris to just facilitate any questions that have come in.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Kat, for that. So yeah, we've always said when we've advertised these, please send questions in to us beforehand or even during, and it's great to see we have had some questions come through whilst we've been talking today. Please keep them coming if you have anything you need to ask. It's also great to see through the Q&A as well, people are offering advice to one another as well when we've got questions. So we will look to try and address all of those, plus some of the questions that we've had already. So a couple that we've had out, and we've got a couple that have come in. We've had one question that came in earlier this week asking, will we see further clarity on enforcement advice? Police and local authorities are inconsistent across the UK. I think we will, yes. It is a really difficult one because you've got police forces taking the advice they've got, and some are using it in one way, some using it in another. Seeing a lot of national coverage in the press, particularly thinking about Derbyshire Police in the Peak District, how they use drone footage to highlight people going into the Peak District and why it was not advisable, and they were heavily criticised for that. I think we are probably going to see more guidance as it goes. It's very much a learning experience, particularly for police and local authorities. We have to remember this is something we've never had to face before, and I think there is a degree of needing to give everyone time to understand it. I think I saw a stat yesterday that said the Met Police in London haven't issued a single fine yet, whereas Lancashire constabulary have issued a considerable number of fines. So each are treating it differently. I think as this goes, we will see more guidance and more support. I know that internally the police force as well are doing a lot of training for their own staff, trying to help advise officers how best to approach issues. I think they are doing their best in terms of looking at trying to encourage people to move on or address the problems of people gathering in groups first before using any form of enforcement, but they're taking that forward. I've got a question for you here, Kat, in terms of following up from what you were talking about around human-led comms. And I think one of the questions we've had is, what advice can you give on communicating difficult financial decisions, both internally and externally?
Well, look, I think there's things that you should do as a responsible employee, whether in a crisis situation or not. So fundamentally, you know, make sure that the employees have been talked to before it is out there in media or on social media. I think that, again, I think trying to simplify language and talk to people in a way that they understand. As I said up front, you know, there's a number of phrases which have been, you know, used a lot at the moment: furlough, social distancing, lots of reference and acronyms. And I think, again, if you're dealing with particularly a younger workforce, they've never maybe been through this. I think a number of us who've obviously been working longer and have had things like lived through the recession, etc., will have sort of be more familiar with these kind of processes. So I think that my advice would be, you know, take a leaf out of the, you know, some of the CEOs and some of the business leaders we've seen who are doing really great comms. Be human, have those conversations one-on-one. Obviously, there's a need sometimes to, you know, put it out on an email. But I think, again, if it's people being affected from kind of furlough, job losses, whatever that might be, a human touch, as I said, really human comms, showing that you as an employer are like really do care about them. And yeah, don't follow the Tim Martin school of bad news delivery, I would say, as a general point. But I think just be human and just be, you know, just use language that people will understand and direct them. There is, as Chris has said, there is so much help and advice out there. And I think people, you know, not feeling intimidated or stupid for asking questions is really, really important, and knowing everything that is available to them.
And just on that, Kat, one of the questions, we had a couple of questions during the event today while we've been speaking from Gary from Wilson Shaw. Thank you, Gary, for sending these in, specifically asking about support for businesses, support for self-employed and so on. I know that Vicky from the Business Growth Hub has responded and said she's happy to get in touch with Gary to help answer those questions. Just for everyone else's benefit, it's very much about asking about what financial support is there, particularly for the self-employed, for those individuals who set themselves up as directors and company directors of businesses. Now, I do know there is advice out there. The Business Growth Hub certainly has it. I know Pro Manchester is also directing people to it, and I think more and more information is only going to come out, because as we're seeing, as people are testing the support the government has provided, we are finding situations where people are left out in the cold of it. So I think there will be more information that comes out and more support that is released. I think one thing that can be said for this government, and particularly for this Chancellor who has been looking at supporting business, is that he has said he's willing to do everything that's necessary. Sadly, however, that does mean sometimes that there are businesses and individuals who are missing out, but the more examples that we can find as a community, and we can pass those on to people like the Growth Hub, to Andy Burnham and to others, the louder the voice that your voices will be, and the more opportunity we'll have to make sure that the Treasury and the Chancellor is addressing it. So I can only, picking up what Kat said, there are no stupid questions when it comes to this. It is better that we all ask these questions, then collaboratively come together and try to address them and answer them. Another question that we had earlier is in regards, sadly, to the death toll that we've seen rise. And I know we've had another rise, a dramatic rise today. And someone asking, is it still expected that are we still expecting this trajectory as we wait for isolation measures to have an impact? Honestly, I don't think any of us can directly answer that with an honest answer, simply because no one really knows. I think during today's press conference with Andy Burnham and Sir Richard Leese, Richard Leese actually has said that he's not expecting the curve to flatten anytime soon. and the Mayor, Andy Burnham, has also said that he's expecting Greater Manchester to face a very tough month ahead. So take that, I think, in terms of what we could expect, but no one, I don't think, can really address that directly, and I think it'd be unfair to. All we can do is all of us do our bit, stay at home, stay safe, protect the NHS, and so on. Another question that we've had, which I have to be honest, raised a dry smile from me, which came through, thank you Ilona for passing it over to us, is that members have reported a lot of antisocial behaviour in Piccadilly Gardens. I didn't know if this was a question from a long time ago or whether it was from this week, to be honest, but less about that the better. Have we got enough police support? Well, one thing that was announced today from the Mayor's briefing is that the Chief Constable has said that 1 in 5 staff at Greater Manchester Police are currently out of action. So whatever pressures the police may have been under previously, they are under more so now, with the number of staff who are currently off isolating because of COVID-19. They are saying they're trying to be as taking a proactive approach as possible, but I think, like all of the public sector and all of the NHS and healthcare system that we currently have, whether it is in social care, in hospitals, GP surgeries, everywhere, I think everyone is under pressure at the moment, and that does include the police. So I think in answering that question, I think they're doing what they can, and I'm sure they will try and address the issue as quickly as possible. With that, I want to make sure that we do try and make sure we finish on a really positive note, because I know that a lot of these briefings can be particularly negative when we're talking about what's happening, the issues that we've got. And Kat, I wanted to ask you one final question, really, because obviously you've returned to the Northwest after a period both abroad and in London, so you've been able to rejoin the Manchester community and kind of see things from a slightly different perspective to those of us who have been here a little bit longer. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, you talked about the communities coming together, whether it is in your local, on your streets or local businesses. What has been your experience with Manchester as a business community? But also, what do you think makes Manchester well placed to handle this crisis?
Well, I'm glad I'm getting the positive end note, Chris. So yeah, as Chris mentioned, I've actually moved back to the Northwest in the last 3 months. So, you know, interesting time to be expanding our business up here. But I think, you know, what I've seen, having spent time, you know, London, as I just mentioned, Hong Kong, is the just general generosity of spirit of the community. You know, me coming back into the community as kind of a senior leader in a business, I have had nothing but welcoming, and it's been very, very humbling, actually. And I think one of Henry Morrison, who I'm sure a lot of you know, actually has said to me, like, you know, it's great people, you know, like Grayling expanding in our city, because it means that, you know, there's more great business and investment. And I think it's funny to think that even only a month or so ago, we were all focused on kind of, you know, repaying the kind of the voters of Brexit, and everyone's talking about the Northern Powerhouse. And I don't think that will go away. But I think that what I've experienced is, you know, what a strong community from a business perspective, but also what a strong leader you have in Andy Burnham. And I think, you know, he's been, as Chris mentioned, so omnipresent in, you know, really, I mean, can any of us even remember that there's a Labour leadership race going on right now? So I think, you know, he's really put himself out there. So I think, you know, when we look at new communities, new ways of working together, collaboration, I can only speak from experience of having lived in a number of major cities over the last sort of 15 years, that coming back and seeing that strength of spirit and collaboration, I think hopefully means that as we move out of this crisis, and again, another interesting point is not everybody in the UK are going to move out of it at the same time. Cities and towns will probably have different responses. But I think, you know, I feel positive in terms of that recalibration and re-evaluation phase, and that the spirit within Manchester will be really well placed to deal with that. So on that note, hopefully.
Thank you, Kat. Last thing from me then, before we close up today, because I don't think we've had any more questions come through, is just thinking about the week ahead. Now, as I said, every day there is something new happening. So we will be continuing with our daily COVID-19 updates and briefings. So if you are interested in receiving them, please get in touch with me or have a look on our website for details. Just further from that, there are a few things happening next week to look out for. Kat mentioned the Labour leadership. We are finally getting an end to the Labour leadership contest of who will replace Jeremy Corbyn. So that's taking place this weekend. So we will have someone as Her Majesty's official leader of the opposition from next week. We may see the end of Boris Johnson in isolation. He said that he's spending 7 days self-isolating, which in itself has caused a lot of questions because the World Health Organization says that it should be 14 days. He's saying 7. So there's some questions being asked around that. And also going back to what we were saying earlier around support for businesses, I think that will only continue in the next week. There will probably be more announcements or more grants becoming available as and when the Chancellor sees fit to do it. And similarly, more and more information about what's happening to support the NHS and our key workers across the board. So all of that is likely to happen in the next 7 days. What else happens, anybody else knows. But we will do our best to make sure everyone's up to date. And obviously we'll look forward to next Wednesday when we'll try and do another summary of what's been going on in the last 7 days. So with that, Ilona, I'll hand back to you to wind up.
That's wonderful. Thanks ever so much, Chris, and also to Kat. Just sharing on the screen their contact details and also the link to go to for the daily updates that we've mentioned. We'll send that link out separately to anyone who's registered for this webinar. It is genuinely one of the most useful resources that we have within Pro Manchester for just keeping up to date with the sheer volume of announcements that are going on. So if, like many of us, you start to feel a bit overwhelmed by everything that is going on in the news, everything that's being shared out on various forms of social media, it really is a good catch-all. So highly recommend having a look at that. And as I say, I will share the link out as well. So finally from me then is just a thank you for joining us, and thanks again to Chris and Kat for sharing their time and expertise with us. One of the things that I think is really important to take away is that we don't know where things are going to go even by this time next week. We will continue to do these webinars to keep you up to date. But as much as there is that focus on what's happening short term, and absolutely, as Chris mentioned, the message is still very much stay at home, stay safe, reduce that pressure on the NHS as much as we possibly can. We do need to have that one eye on the future as to what the world's going to look like as we get to the tail end of this, potentially different parts of the country coming out of it at different times, what businesses are still going to be around. And for me, one of the things that I'll really take away from today is Kat's advice around that human-led communication. I think that's important at any time, and it's great to see brands embracing that, and to see some of the backlash against the brands who are perhaps not doing that as well. So hopefully what we will come out of this is a stronger community, better connected, and more supportive of each other. So on that note, thank you ever so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week.